This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? I don't know what the hell is not going on. Summer is supposed to be a time of rest and relaxation, and instead we are here talking about...
the Ukrainian invasion of Russia. You heard that right. Not the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Ukrainian invasion of Russia. So while we were off doing our summer book series and indulging occasionally in political talk over the month of August, the Ukrainians invaded Russia, and they have seized 1,000 square kilometers, about 400 square miles of Russian territory in the Kursk Oblast, Kursk region of Russia, and they're holding it. And the Russians are diverting some troops over there to, not to take it back because they really kind of can't, but to not make sure they don't take more. And this is just I think, a brilliant move on the part of the Ukrainians. What do you think, Danny?
So I think that the Ukrainians have been in an invidious position for a while. Part of the problem with the Ukraine war, Russia's war on Ukraine, is that it has developed a narrative separate from reality, right? So if you ask your average Joe Blow, how is the war going? The answer is, it's not going well for Ukraine. There's a stalemate going on, and it's going to drag out. Maybe they're even going to lose. That's why they agreed to some sort of, peace talks in the Gulf, which are now canceled or mostly canceled. And the reality is that's not true. And so as a tactical matter, they've changed the narrative with their incursion into Russia. And I think that is more important than the actual territorial gain. Although the territorial gain is pretty damn important. I mean, well, you guys will hear from our guest how long it took Ukraine to take this much territory versus how much time it took Russia to take the same amount of territory in Ukraine. It's pretty amazing.
What's amazing is it's the second major big victory for the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians also won the Battle of the Black Sea, which is that they took, remember this whole war started with the great Russian ship Moskva coming to Snake Island and telling them to surrender, and the troops on Snake Island said, "Russian warship, fuck you." and they took them, and they took them prisoner. Everyone thought they had died in the conflict, but they survived it actually. And got less attention was that the Moskva is now sitting at the bottom of the Black Sea, because the Ukrainian forces, without a navy, using mostly Ukrainian-made sea drones and some European-provided and now American-provided longer-range weapons, have so threatened the Russian Navy that they pulled out after they sunk so many of their ships. I think they sunk a third of the Black Sea Fleet, the pride of the Russian Navy, and drove them out of Ukrainian territorial waters, which allowed the grain trade to resume, because they had been essentially creating a blockade of Ukrainian grain. And now, on another front, on the land, they've invaded Russian territory and seized it and are holding it. These are two big moves on the part of the Ukrainians, offensive successes. So I think you're right. This narrative of the stalemate where the Ukrainians are destined to lose because of demography and the advantage in personnel that the Russians have and all the other reasons is really not true.
No, I think that's right. And I also think that we don't talk enough about the inroads that Russian propaganda have made in the United States, where, again, most people are normal. They're not paying obsessive interest to casualty numbers from the Russians, casualty numbers from the Ukrainians, what's happening in this oblast or that oblast, or what's going on over this river or that, brother. Right. This is a small war far away about which we know little. And the problem is that when we do turn our spotlight on it, what we see is an enormous number of lies from people who are reading American press, not the New York Times, not the Washington Post, not the Wall Street Journal, but who are reading Facebook, who are listening to people that they maybe respect ideologically, who are in their ideological, sort of circle of trust. And we are hearing lie after lie after lie about this war. And there's another problem, of course, which is that the pro-Russian people are lying, but the Biden administration is also lying. The Biden administration has tied the hands of the Ukrainians at every possible moment.
Yes.
They're still not letting them attack deeper into Russia. They're still allowing them to be sitting ducks. They're still slow rolling weaponry. They're still misbehaving whenever they can because of their morbid fear of escalation by Vladimir Putin, which again is a psyop on the part of Vladimir Putin that is succeeding against the president of the United States. The whole thing is really, it's like living in a fantasy world.
It is. And Jack Keane will, in our discussion, will sort of explain for those who are concerned about it why it is highly unlikely that Russia will escalate into a fight with NATO, much less use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. But the problem that you have is that the Russians have developed a tactic of attacking Ukrainian infrastructure, so their power grid and other things, and also Russian cities, using glide bombs from Russian jets. So they have airfields in Russia that are out of the range of the permitted range of the Ukrainian fire, not the range of Ukrainian fire, but the permitted range, but permitted by Biden. And they just take off and fly into Russian cities and bomb schools and bomb cities and bomb power plants. And then, and the Ukrainians can engage them once they're over their territory. But the Biden administration, there was a point, there was one Russian airfield where all the planes were just sitting there on the airfield. And the Ukrainians said to the Biden administration, let us take them out. And the Biden administration said, no. These are planes that are near Ukrainian territory for one reason, to kill Ukrainian civilians, to attack Ukrainian infrastructure. They shouldn't be there. And the Biden administration wouldn't let them do it. So finally, the Ukrainians did it using drones, which was much less effective, but had some impact. This is what the Ukrainians are dealing with every day. Absolute incompetence, absolute fear. And I'm reading Yaro Trofimov's book, which we had him on to talk about the podcast a few months ago. But I'm reading it in full. I was on a long car ride, and so listened to it on the audio book. And just his description of how they slow-rolled the weapons in the first months of the war. I mean, it wasn't until May that they gave them the HIMARS.
Right.
So the Ukrainians had to fight with both hands tied behind their backs and Soviet weapons for the entire period where they stopped the Russian assault on Kyiv. It was only later, after they succeeded in pushing them back, that they finally allowed them to have these Western weapons. And then every year, it's drip, drip, drip. They give them some more. They say, no, we can't give you this. And then they finally give it to them. Then they say, no, we won't give you that. They finally give it to them. If they had everything that they have now, and they had given it to the Ukrainians in the first months of the war,
this would be over.
It would be over. It would be over, and the Russians would have been decisively defeated. But Biden has dragged this thing out. He's created openings for the opposition here in the United States to the war. He's cost untold Ukrainian lives, both civilian and military, and he's given Putin a lifeline.
Right.
It's just the most disgraceful, incompetent effort to support an ally I've ever seen in my life.
Right. And I want to talk more about this after we air our interview, because I want to talk more about how history is going to judge Joe Biden and a little bit more about the politics of this.
And a little bit about Trump, and a little bit about what will happen under Trump. Let's save that for the end.
We shall see. But first, everybody remembers General Jack Keane, who we adore. Oh, maybe I should speak only for myself, Mark. I adore.
I adore him too.
He is a recidivist guest with us, a retired four-star general, former vice chief of staff of the U.S. Army. He's the chairman of the Institute for the Study of War. He's a Fox News senior strategic analyst. And he is a member of the Secretary of Defense's Policy Board. He has been around for a long time, and we'll let you judge how well he knows whereof he speaks.
Here's our interview. Well, Jack, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, delighted to be here, as always.
Well, we love having you. So, for the past 3 years or so, we've been talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but now Ukraine has invaded Russia. What the hell is going on?
Yeah, well, that's certainly a bold and impressive move on the part of the Ukrainians. I think strategically what they're trying to do is, while the Institute for the Study of War, which I'm associated with, as you know, we don't believe for a minute that the war is stalemated. The general perception is that it is, because there's not wide swath of changes taking place, anything dramatic. But I think the Ukrainians had in mind that their political support that they need from the United States and Europe, and even what they get out of Asia, is dependent on the fact that there really is some hope for them, that they can achieve their goals. And I think this bold move is a demonstration that they are completely committed to achieving their goals in Ukraine, getting their territory back, that they're determined and they're willing to still fight for it. So I think strategically, that's what they had in mind. Militarily, they clearly want to do a couple things. One is force the Russians to reposition from their offensive operation that they're doing in the Donbass region to this area and relieve some of the pressure there. The third military thing is Russia really has a 1,000-mile border on the eastern part of Ukraine. And Ukraine has really put that at risk. And Russia really hasn't been defending that border. And now they'll have to commit multiple divisions to that end. And that cannot but help Ukraine also, as it's trying to conduct its limited counteroffensive operations beginning later this year and also next year. So those are some of the things I think that are involved. And obviously, it's a morale boost for the Ukrainian military. I don't want to overstate how it undermines Putin, but it does show weakness once again in the part of his military. And it breaks the narrative a little bit in terms of what he's doing with his state television and continuously bombasting the Russian people about their successes and how they're stamping out the Nazis and the fascism that's taken place and at the behest of the United States. So I think it's a win for the Ukrainians in that sense. And I really applaud them once again for their imagination and boldness.
Do you think that they can hold that territory for a while? And do you think that part of the motivation is in anticipation of a possible Trump administration where he claims that he's going to get both sides to the negotiating table right away on coming into office? And if they're holding Russian territory, then they say, okay, we want Donetsk back, but we've got Kursk. So if you want Kursk back, you got to give us back our territory. Is it a negotiating tactic as well?
Yeah, and that's what I meant. I mean, in terms of the strategic objective and the political will and continued support, I think it's tied to that. Yes, they can hold. What's happening is they're consolidating. Russia is trying to contain the expansion. So they have moved in thousands of troops to do that. The Ukrainians are making certain that their positions are defendable, so they're digging in a little bit. The Russians are also digging in to make certain that the Ukrainians don't go any further. But here's the key. For Russia to get them out of there, in other words, to force them back across the Ukrainian border, we're months away from that. That will require a Russian offensive to do that, and they have not put that together yet. So yes, they'll be there for several months in our judgment. And yes, and certainly they can be used as leverage in any potential upcoming negotiations.
Jack, it's great to hear your voice, as always. I want to ask you about something you said right at the beginning. You said that the general perception is a stalemate, and I think that's true. I think that people generally think this is a no-win situation, which is why time is ripe for a deal or something like that. Can you just explain to our listeners why the stalemate assessment is wrong? Not just the Ukrainian troops in Russia, obviously, that's a bit of a game changer, although maybe not as much as you're suggesting right now. But what leads us to believe this is not a stalemate?
Yeah, well, first of all, given the delay of weapons and ammunition coming into Ukraine, as we're all very much aware of, given the political situation in the United States, Ukrainians have largely been on the defense and Russia's been using their ground forces to conduct an offensive operation in the Donbass region. They poured a lot into that. Much of the 300,000 plus conscripts and others that they mobilized this last year are in that fight. And while they have made some tactical gains, they haven't made significant operational gains anywhere near what they thought they were going to do. And this once again points out the weakness of Russian offensive maneuver operations. Their casualties are staggeringly high, much as we had seen in the very outset back in 22. I said they have made some gains, but nothing near what they wanted. Their air campaign was the second thing that they were committed to, the Russian forces, to break the will of the Ukrainian people. So they increased the scale of their operations, knowing full well that the Ukrainians did not have the interceptors that they've had in the past, given the holdup of the United States Congress. As a result of that, Ukraine went from 7 to 8 successful interceptions every time an attack took place to something around 4 out of 10, which was dramatically different. That meant more casualties, more infrastructure destroyed, more energy infrastructure damaged. Despite all of that, they have not broken the will of the Ukrainian people, is what one of those objectives were, and they're still being able to patch together their energy infrastructure, despite the fact that about half of it has been damaged in some capacity. Also, in terms of maritime operations, the Ukrainians, without a navy, have been able to push the Russian Navy out of the Black Sea, which is going to have to be a special chapter in the history of this war in of itself, in my view. Again, it's one, and doing so with imagination and boldness, completing that using drones in the air, at sea, and some undersea vehicles as well. So much so that the export of grain, while it's not anywhere near what it should be, it's something south of 40%, which has been able to sustain their economy to some degree. So those are the things that are going on, I think, that demonstrate that it's not stalemated. Plus, the Ukrainians, using advanced weapon systems that the United States and the Europeans have given them, have been pummeling Crimea. And they've been taking down air defense systems rather significantly in preparation for the arrival of the F-16s, and also damaging other Russian military capability. The Ukrainians really want to do as much damage as they can to military targets inside Ukraine, going back to Mark's point, as leverage in negotiations with Putin. They believe as that capacity comes down inside Ukraine, that would force Putin to the negotiating table. So this is lost in the general viewpoint about Ukraine because the lines haven't moved that much, on the ground. But there's a lot happening every single day, which indicates the war is not stalemated. But nonetheless, I understand the general perception.
You mentioned the arrival of the F-16s. That's been more than a year and a half in the making. It's been painfully slow. I read in, I think, the New York Times a few weeks ago that they've only trained 6 Ukrainian pilots or something like that because there were no training slots. I mean, even after they made the decision to go ahead and allow this, it seems like they're just incompetent in executing the training and delivery of these weapons to the Ukrainians. Why is this so hard?
Yeah, well, everything takes time, that's for sure. The promised number of aircraft is supposed to be about 60. I'll be surprised if they get that. I think what we really have trained is a couple of dozen pilots. That's about it. And more in the queue. Part of the problem is the language barrier and also the extensive training that's needed. It's a much more complicated airplane, to be sure. And of course, from the United States perspective, I mean, we got forced into this. The Europeans forced the tanks on us. Remember, Biden administration feared escalation, didn't want to send tanks. The Europeans forced us to do it. Didn't want to send advanced long-range missiles. They sent their cruise missiles. We finally relented. And then the F-16s was another case in point. One of the things that can help this is there are a number of retired F-16 pilots, United States in particular, Europeans as well, who are willing to get into this. And as they started down this road several months ago to get into it, they were told by the administration their pensions and their retirement would be at risk if they pursued this. If you can believe this, the person who was talking to me about it is sort of the leader of this effort. I don't know him personally, but I've spoken to him a few times. I have a tendency to trust him. He seems to make sense. He seems like a very worthy person attempting to do something that's good here. And he has a number of other pilots that are willing to do this. I brought this up to the Deputy Minister of Defense. I brought it up to the Defense Attaché. I got Mike McCall, Chairman, Foreign Affairs, Lindsey Graham, major Ukrainian advocate, involved in this. Graham has mentioned it to Zelensky on his last visit, and Zelensky mentioned it publicly. It looks like they've come up with, not too surprising, a solution. They'll dual citizenship these guys, take the burden away from the United States, having to interfere with it. And secondly, the last thing I've heard out of the State Department is they will not oppose it. They will not support it. They're just going to keep their head in the sand in doing this. It is just so frustrating and so typical of these half steps that they take to hold back the Ukrainians from being able to accomplish what needs to be done here. And I'm a mind to understand, listening to the pilots talk about it, a number of these guys are instructor pilots. So if you have a few of these in the 4 or 5 squadrons that they're trying to form, the enhancement of the Ukrainian capability is quite significant by having combat experienced F-16 pilots. And the Europeans want to get in there. So that may be a way to bridge some of the gap that you're talking about here, Mark, and not having enough pilots. But it falls right in line with everything else. Look, we've given them 31 Abrams tanks. We got over 200 in storage in Germany in the event a war breaks out with Russia. To include Bradley fighting vehicles, to include engineer equipment. We've got 2 sets of this stuff in the event there's a war with Russia. And I have made the point to the leaders of the Defense Department, the war is obviously here. Let's accept the risk. Let's open up the warehouses, give all of it to Ukrainians now, and then build back that capability over time and put it back in the warehouse. And for the life of me, why that hasn't been done months ago is beyond me. But it's just so typical of what is happening here. I do believe the Defense Department would like to break through these barriers, given the responses they've had to my comments, but they are being held in check by the policymakers in the White House on Ukraine.
Well, that would also create jobs in Lima, Ohio, which a certain vice presidential candidate ought to like, but we won't get into that. But I just want to understand what you were saying earlier, just to be clarify for our listeners. There are U.S. retired F-16 pilots who want to go to Ukraine to help the Ukrainians operate their new F-16s, and the Pentagon was threatening to take away their pensions if they did it?
No, I mean, it didn't come from the Department of Defense. Mm-hmm. It came from the State Department, that they were threatening the fact that their retirements would be at risk if they did something like that. That has, since that threat, I understand, has been removed. And they're now they're not going to oppose it, but they're not going to support it either. So whatever you guys do, go ahead and do it. The Ukrainians have figured out to do dual citizenship to make it a lot easier for them to deal with the United States government.
Wow. That's just stunning.
It's pathetic. But I mean, this is something we talk about in every instance where we have a decisive opportunity to do good. American people want to do good, and bureaucrats want to stand in their way. I feel like I talk about this with you every couple of years, and the only thing that changes is the name of the country. But I want to ask you, though, about this outstanding piece you had in the New York Post. It was on August 6th. It said the war is fraught but winnable in Ukraine if the West steps up against Russia. Given our conversation just now and that last clause, I know you didn't write the headline, but the West needs to step up. Sure, the Poles are doing a lot. The Brits have been doing some. The Biden administration is slow rolling everything, especially given the electoral season that is now upon us. Do you still feel like we can have any confidence that the West is actually going to step up?
Yeah, well, certainly that was written to get people's attention that, this thing is not stalemated and Ukraine can still accomplish much of what they're attempting to do, but they're going to need continued and sustained support to deal with that. I'm of a mind that the Prime Minister Netanyahu said it best. Give me the equipment and the things I need as quickly as you can, and I can get this ended as quickly as possible. Words to that effect. That's not an exact quote. And that should be the mantra in dealing with Zelensky. I mean, if President Trump becomes the president of the United States again, and he's going to deal with this issue, I would hope that Zelensky is able to put in front of him what he's trying to achieve and what he needs to achieve it. And it would seem to me that that's the best answer of all. Give him full throttle support and get out of his way so we can get on with it, as opposed to what we've been doing. This administration has fundamentally protracted the war, fundamentally added casualties on the Ukrainian side to the war by these half measures and policy restrictions. You can see the one that's now being inflicted on them with not being able to use advanced long-range ATACMS inside of Russia when there's hundreds of concentration of military targets that are there that complement Russia's offensive operation because they're able to move this military capability closer to the border because it's a sanctuary for them and therefore support their ground operations that are taking place inside Ukraine. And Ukraine sees that advantage that Russia has and wants to pummel it and take it away from them. Now, they're trying to do it as best they can with drones that they have, but the ATACMS, the precision weapons that it is, would be absolutely devastating for them to release that. And it starts to erode Russia's capabilities, and it starts to put Ukraine on a faster clock for war termination. But yet they're completely paralyzed from doing something like that. I would hope that a change of administration, if there is a change, that something like that would be removed immediately. But we'll have to see.
Well, so apropos of that, and we've discussed this before, Jack, along various iterations of the war at various periods. Politics is a big part of why everything isn't working as well as it should, whether it's Israel and Netanyahu, or it's Zelensky and it's Ukraine, or it's Russia. I want to read you a paragraph, though, because it made me light my hair on fire. I want to light my hair on fire. Listen to this, okay? The war is the predictable response of Russia to the neocon project to expand NATO and encircle Russia. We unilaterally walked away from 2 intermediate nuclear weapons treaties with Russia and then put nuclear weapons in Romania and Poland. This is a hostile act, and the Biden and White House repeatedly spurned Russia's offers to settle this war. Okay? Can you guess who said that?
No. Who said it?
Standing next to Donald Trump, giving him his endorsement, it was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And I didn't read you the worst part of it. So my fear is we may be going from bad to equally bad. And I want to be reassured. Do you have a sense that we may actually have the guts to help the Ukrainians win this war if there's a change in government in Washington?
Well, look, I try not to get involved in any of the campaigns, but in terms of if there's a change to President Trump, I did have a conversation with him several months ago about the war in Ukraine out of my concern for some of the things that he was saying, and he seemed to be somewhat opposed to it. My experience with President Trump in dealing with foreign policy, some of it, in the Oval Office, I don't want to overstate my importance here, but it did involve a reversal of the decision on Syria to keep troops there, is that he does listen very well, and he asks very good questions, and he's somewhat coachable. I've always had this impression that when it comes to Ukraine, that once he gets all the facts, and once he gets classified briefings, that will enlighten him in terms of what Russia's intent really is when it comes to Europe writ large, and understands the strategic issues that are at play here, then I have of a mind that the campaign is behind. Now I'm dealing with responsibility and accountability myself, and what is in the best interest of the Ukrainians. And I think it's going to be pretty self-evident, and that is to get this thing over as soon as possible and give them what they need to deal with that, as opposed to brokering a deal which would possibly leave Ukraine holding the bag quite a bit in terms of territory that Russia is still occupying. Ukraine has opportunities here at the end of this year and the beginning of next to begin to roll back some territory. Not massive offensive operation like they did last year and were not able to break through the Russia's defense in depth. It was just too big a problem for them to take on, and they didn't have all the equipment for them to deal with it. And they know that, and our military commanders, like General Cavoli, has been very honest and upfront about their own failings and having unrealistic expectations of what the Ukrainians could and could not do. But I have in mind that there still can be significant progress made. I think once a commander-in-chief avails himself of that information, those around him understand the facts. They understand what Russia's intent is here. They also get to understand Russia's vulnerabilities. I think there is opportunity here still to support Ukraine's objectives and what they're trying to achieve. I have not given up the hope that can be accomplished.
I share your hope, Jack, from my conversations with President Trump as well. And I would note, Danny, that Robert F. Kennedy is an idiot and that he was standing next to the guy who withdrew from the INF treaty when he said those words. So, he was literally criticizing Donald Trump standing next to him and probably didn't even realize it. But I wonder...
Well, apparently neither did Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, I think he wants his endorsement because I think he thinks it's going to help him win, which is what the campaign is all about. But I wonder how steadfast the Harris administration would be for Ukraine if it won, because we were just talking a moment ago about their hesitation in allowing the Ukrainians to use the ATACMS on Russian air bases where there are planes sitting that are daily taking off, flying to Ukraine and dropping these glide bombs that are doing all these disasters. And the the Biden administration won't let the Ukrainians take them out with US-made weapons. And I'm looking at this Political, since Danny's reading stuff from the press, so can I. This is from Politico. Officials in certain corners of the administration have told the Ukrainians that the U.S. will eventually want to reset relations with Moscow, and lifting the restrictions could upend those efforts. So they're already looking at another Russian reset in the Biden-Harris world.
Yeah, well, I don't get involved in commenting on what's happening in the campaign, and obviously the vice president is running for election. But in terms of the current policy and where I think this administration continues to go, there's going to be no change in handcuffing the Ukrainians. It's just that policy is in place. It's not going to change. It is largely driven by Jake Sullivan. He has the president's ear on this. He's of a mind that escalation is still an issue, that escalation in the sense that Russia brandishes the threat of nuclear weapons. And if we escalate and take on that added risk, then we're bringing that hell down on ourselves. The Europeans have walked away from this. I give them some credit because last year they looked at this and they came to the conclusion this is a hollow threat. And Russia is using it as part of its information campaign to affect Western and U.S. decision-making and attempting to do it quite successfully. And why wouldn't they continue it, given the impact it already has? But the Europeans walked away from it, and that's why they forced the tanks on us and the ATACMS and the F-16s. They know full well. And isn't the Ukraine's salient that they've now established in Kursk, where they have as many square miles under their control as what Russia's entire offensive operation for this last year has got under its control in terms of new territory? Isn't that another case in point? My God, now we got Ukrainians standing on Russian territory and owning it and pushing 130,000 people out of their towns and villages that they live in and occupying in terms of settlements. Some are very small. Small settlements in towns, close to 100 now, are under Ukrainian control. And where's the escalation? It's not happening. This has just been a false premise driven by people who can't handle their own fear. They get paralyzed by the fear of adverse consequence. And I saw it in the Obama administration for 8 years. And many of these people who are fostering these policies upon the Ukrainians were part of that administration. It's learned behavior, and it's on display, and it's a thread that runs through all of our foreign policy. You can see it in the Middle East. The emphasis is on de-escalation, 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 as opposed to putting the emphasis and pinning the rose on Iran, who's causing all of the escalation. But we're focusing on de-escalation, and they just miss the whole point of what is taking place there because they want to avoid confrontation. It's astounding. Our adversaries are really well on to us, and that's how they're able to take advantage of us.
Could you, for our listeners who haven't thought all this through so carefully, can you explain? I mean, most Americans would probably be very worried about nuclear war breaking out over Ukraine. Can you explain why the Europeans and you think it's an empty threat?
Well, I think the Europeans just looked at it very coldly, recognizing full well that if you use nuclear weapons inside of Europe, that would force NATO into the war. And as a result of that, Putin loses everything that he has. So our audience to understand, we wouldn't respond with nuclear weapons. I doubt it. I mean, that would be an option, but I don't think so. I mean, the United States and NATO, we know where everything Russian is, where it is inside of Ukraine, and where everything outside of Ukraine and close to Ukraine is supporting the war in terms of military capability. We would be all over that with air power. And in a matter of days, I mean, we know how to defeat Russian air defense systems, and all the rest of that would be vulnerable to massive air U.S.-led NATO attack that would destroy everything that the Russia has. I mean, it would take them years to recover from that. Their generals know that full well, how vulnerable they would be to something like that. Certainly, Putin has been apprised of that himself, and it just doesn't make any sense that they would do something like that would invite their own destruction to that degree, when it's much easier to bluff their way with the United States and continue to accomplish what they have accomplished. And that is for the United States to handcuff the Ukrainians and protract the war. The longer the war drags on, it favors Russia. So the more interference in political will in the United States, it's going to help Russia. We know, and you know as well as I do, you folks at AEI know, that Russia conducted a very massive information campaign here targeted against Republicans to stiffen them in terms of their resolve not to support Ukraine. It was a sophisticated, high-end campaign that was being pummeled against them for months because it's in Russia's interest to slow down that political support. That's a much more viable option for them. And by God, they've had some success with it.
They have. No, I mean, look, they have. Exit question from me, Jack, because as usual, you're being hyper generous with your time. One of the things that I think is too often missing from the discourse is not the cost of this war, which we hear about constantly, not Russian advances, which we hear about constantly, not Ukrainian losses, which we hear about constantly, but what the risk of an actual Ukrainian loss in this war would mean to us. Can you just give our listeners something to understand here? Because this is not a situation where, oh, we can just do nothing and then nothing will happen to us. There are consequences here. What are the consequences if Putin wins?
We had a tendency not to take Putin all that serious. He's been talking for some time before what took place here in 22, but going all the way back to prior to 2014, but from 2014 on, after Crimea was annexed and he moved into eastern Ukraine. And remember, the history here is Putin's stooge, Yanukovych, was fundamentally opposed. He's running Ukraine, and he's opposed to the Ukraine looking economically to the West, to the European Union, and politically and militarily looking to NATO in terms of an alliance. But that is where the Ukrainian people and the opposition parties were moving. And the overwhelming majority of the Ukrainian people saw security and economic opportunity in the West and no longer with Russia. So much so that they, through a series of demonstrations real fast, Yanukovych was kicked out of there by his own people. And he fled where? He fled to Russia. And as a result of that, because of that humiliation, Putin realized that he had to move strongly, particularly in terms of his own people, making certain that they understood that he was very much in charge and he wasn't going to tolerate this. And that's why he moved into Crimea, annexing it, and then into eastern Ukraine. And now, 10 years later, we're dealing with an all-out invasion. So Ukraine has been very important to him in terms of the expansion of Russia, as important as Georgia was, Ukraine is, and the other Eastern European countries. Ukraine holds, in his mind, a particularly historic and cultural significance for him that he doesn't devote as much time to as the other Eastern European countries. But nonetheless, it's all part of the same narrative. Ukraine and expansion into Eastern Europe to put together once again the Russian Empire. He believes that the United States and NATO broke faith with them in bringing into NATO those Eastern European countries. And that should not have been done. And he thinks he had a deal that it was not going to be done. Most people dispute that. So the reality is Putin is dead set on Ukraine as a centerpiece and then move into Eastern Europe. And he's always looked to weaken the transatlantic alliance. I'm not suggesting that he masses forces in Western Ukraine and then moves across the border immediately into Romania, etc. He could do that. I think he would likely, dealing with NATO, he would likely go back to hybrid operations, Baltics being very vulnerable to something like that, where he moves in to quell instability, he stabilizes the situation, but meanwhile he's sitting in the capital of those countries and doing that. I played war games to that effect, and it's very challenging what has to happen as a result of that, because now we're on the offense going after something he has militarily accomplished. But he wants to break NATO, the transatlantic alliance. He thinks it's the glue that has held him back. He's dead set on this stuff. And I've often said to people, if President Trump is going to get reelected, the sooner he gets the classified briefing on this, the better. I can tell you for a fact, I asked Chairman McCall when it came to the discussions dealing with Speaker Johnson on the funding for Ukraine, and when he was not the speaker, he had expressed some opposition to it, and there was some growing concern, where did he really stand on this position? I asked Chairman McCall, has Speaker Johnson received a classified briefing on Russia's intent? He said, I'm not sure. But they eventually got that briefing to him, and he became an ardent supporter and is an ardent supporter right now of Ukraine. I'm not suggesting that's the only reason. There were other things at play, certainly. But once you get informed and educated about what is really at play here, what the stakes are in terms of European security and U.S. vital interest, it is absolutely compelling that Russia gets stopped in Ukraine, because they fully intend to continue if they're able to have that degree of success. And I think most all of the Europeans are of that mind, because they have seen the information. And a lot of it, if you recall, one of the German newspapers leaked out some classified briefings on what I'm talking about here, where Russia's intent in terms of breaking NATO and moving into Eastern Europe was clearly a strategic plan. It wasn't an aspiration. This was a plan, is what they have in mind.
Wow. I wish more people understood what was at stake.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Danny. One of the, I was on this congressional commission for almost 20 months about the seriousness of the threats that we're facing. In this case, we're talking about Russia. But the truth is, the administration doesn't tell the American people about any of it, about the seriousness of these threats, for the obvious reason, because the American people would ask them, what are you going to do about it? And to do something about it would have to change all of their political and social objectives that they have, not the least of which is the defense budget itself. So this danger, this threat, is not discussed with the American people to inform them and educate them.
You know, I'm reading Yaro Trofimov's book on the Ukraine war right now, and one of the things he pointed out, which I hadn't put two and two together, is Vladimir Putin is named for Saint Vladimir the Great, the Prince of Kiev, the founder of the Kievan Rus, from 978 until 1015. So that was about 1,000 years before NATO expansion. If you want an idea of why Vladimir Putin is so obsessed with Ukraine, it's like it's his destiny to be the new Vladimir the Great, who reconquered Ukraine for his own people. But my closing question is this: during the NATO summit, we kept hearing about how all the allies in the Biden administration want to Trump-proof Ukraine. They were going to do all these things to embed this support in different structures and make it hard for Trump to cut off the aid. If you wanted to Trump-proof Ukraine, wouldn't the best thing be to give them everything they're asking for so that they're in the best battlefield position possible when Trump comes into office? Why is that not part of the Trump-proofing strategy?
No, I totally agree with him. Give them everything that they need and take away any restrictions on the use of these weapon systems. This restriction that they imposed is absolutely insanity. Do you know that even in the use of HIMARS, they are telling the Ukrainians, and I heard Jake Sullivan explaining this in an interview in some level of detail. He said, well, on the use of HIMARS, we're restricting them to a Russian attack that is imminent and within 20 kilometers of the Ukrainians, then they would be able to use the HIMARS in reaction to that. So they can't use the HIMARS unrestricted in the whole area. They can only use it if Russia is close to attacking them. I mean, this is the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. Why is he involved in something at that tactical level, imposing that kind of a restriction on the Ukrainian military? I have spoken to Ukrainian military people about this. They are so frustrated with this because they understand the power of those weapon systems and how vulnerable the Russian military is. We are really talking about something that begins to collapse Russia in terms of its military capability. That's the profoundness of what's available if the Ukrainians can get unrestricted and use these weapon systems. We are talking about bringing the war to termination sooner than this protracted path that we're on right now. And it is so frustrating for them to live under that restriction. They don't talk about it too much publicly for all the obvious reasons. They don't want to bite the hand that's feeding them. But it is an incredible level of frustration. Actually have the weapon system, see the enemy on the screen, and not be able to shoot at it. But they can shoot at him. Makes no sense.
You got that right. It makes no sense.
Jack, we hope that Donald Trump is listening to you. We know that Joe Biden isn't listening to anybody right now for a variety of possible reasons, including the fact that he can't. but we hope that if there's a new administration, that they're going to be listening to you and not to the J.D. Vances of the world.
Amen.
Hey, great talking to you guys. Always appreciate it.
Jack, you were amazing.
Thank you, Jack. Take care. So what do you want to talk about first, Danny? Biden or Trump?
So I want to talk for a second about Biden because I will say this. It really sticks in my craw that the Democratic elite are threatening that Putin is going to win if Donald Trump becomes president because, Trump is so soft on Putin, because Trump isn't going to stand with Ukraine. Now, I will say this. If J.D. Vance were the candidate, I'd say that's correct, right?
Agreed.
100% correct.
Agreed.
All I've heard from J.D. Vance is spouting Russian talking points. But that's not the case with Donald Trump. But more importantly, that simply does not own the disgrace that has been the last 2.5 years of Biden administration policy, which really, as we discussed before, Jack, and which you heard with Jack, that story about the F-16s just made me seethe. It is unbelievable what's been going on.
I agree with you 100%. The Biden administration is a disgrace. And the reality is, Donald Trump says this war would have never happened if I had won the 2020 election. You can never prove that. But history is any guide. He's the only president in the 20th century on whose watch Putin didn't invade one of his neighbors. And I don't think that he would have invaded Ukraine under Donald Trump's watch. And keep in mind that before this war began, it was the Obama-Biden administration that refused, after the 2014 invasion and seizure of Crimea, to give Ukraine any lethal aid. They asked for RPGs and they got MREs. They got meals ready to eat and blankets. And the president of Ukraine at the time, Poroshenko, said, we can't fight with blankets, literally. And this was the policy of the Democrats. And then Trump comes in and he approved the transfer of Javelin missiles to the Ukrainians. And they actually used those missiles to defend Kyiv when the Biden administration was refusing to give them Western weapons at the start of the war. So I think it's fair to say that none of this would have happened if Trump had been president. And I think I don't think that Donald Trump will allow Vladimir Putin to march on Kyiv as president of the United States. If for no other reason, then that doesn't happen when Trump is president, is a big point of pride for him. And so, I think that Trump administration is going to try to have some kind of a peace agreement to end the war. And it'll be interesting to see if they are able to get Putin to actually negotiate a peace that is sustainable. And the brilliant thing, coming full circle to the start of our podcast, is that what the Ukrainians have done by seizing Russian territories, they've given themselves leverage in whatever negotiations might come. Okay, you want some Ukrainian territory? Then we'll just keep Kursk. And if you want Kursk back, you got to give us our territory back. And they've created a new political dynamic in the negotiations, which didn't exist before. And I think that's just absolutely awesome.
Well, from your mouth to God's ears, I hope you're right. I'm not sure. I know that vice presidents are not always decisive when it comes to foreign policy. I hope that will be the case if Donald Trump is elected with J.D. Vance by his side.
Same here.
But I worry a lot. I know that you and I both worry about this. But I really, really like your formulation. If, in fact, the Biden administration genuinely believed that Donald Trump was going to sell out Ukraine, why not give them everything right now to win?
Yes.
But, of course, they don't actually believe that. It's just a talking point.
But that's the problem, is they don't actually have a strategy for victory anywhere. They don't have one. They have a strategy not to lose.
Right.
In every conflict, right? It's the same thing in Israel.
Yep.
Let's just have a ceasefire and release the hostages and end this war now.
Iran.
No,
Same
we
with
got
Iran.
we got to destroy Hamas. We want what Israel wants is not the right to defend itself. It wants the right to destroy Hamas and U.S. backing to do that. The objective is victory. And the same thing should be true in Ukraine. Victory. They don't want Putin to lose because they think that'll be destabilizing, because Putin could be very angry if he loses, and he might be angry at us. And so therefore it's better for this conflict to drag out in a low roar, and Americans will forget about it and the Ukrainians can keep dying, but at least we won't have escalation, because God forbid any escalation.
I hope that history judges these people harshly. Let us know what you guys think. Always of great interest. You know that Mark and I care a lot about Ukraine for not just the simple reason that there are people who live in Ukraine who deserve to live in peace and security, but because victory for Vladimir Putin will have implications for all of us. We've been down this road before, right? We lived through the 1930s, 5 neutrality acts, boring Sudetenland, who cares? Reoccupation of the Rhineland, who cares? And we know where that led. So perhaps we could be smarter this time around.
It's a constant hope of those of us who are in the foreign policy geekdom.
Yes. Live and learn. Maybe.
All right.
Anyway, take care, folks.
See you next week. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.